Europe's modern map was carved by the ambitions of families, not nations. For centuries after Rome's fall, the continent resembled a shimmering, unstable mosaic. Each piece of territory was a prize claimed by rival dynasties through conquest, sacred oaths, and strategic marriages. This is the story of how those family empires forged and fractured the world of early medieval Europe, a process that built the very foundations of our modern states. By the end, you will possess a crucial lens to understand the deep origins of European identity and conflict. We will see how a single royal coronation could reshape a continent, and why a treaty signed by three brothers created a border that still echoes today. What does it truly take for a family name to become stamped upon the land? That moment in 476 is often presented as a clean break, a single date that marks the end of one world and the beginning of another. But for the people living through it, the change was far less dramatic and much more confusing. The last emperor was simply packed off to a comfortable retirement. No great battle was lost that year, no capital city sacked. The true collapse had been a slow unraveling over generations, a gradual fading of imperial power from the provinces. What remained was not a void, but a complex inheritance. The physical skeleton of Rome was still there, its stone roads connecting hollowed-out cities, its aqueducts still bringing water to places where the old civic order had dissolved. This was the landscape the new powers stepped into. It was not an empty stage, but one cluttered with the magnificent, half-ruined set pieces of a previous act. The challenge for every ambitious leader was not to build from nothing, but to decide which parts of that Roman inheritance to claim, which to ignore, and how to make it their own. The most valuable legacy was not the crumbling stone, but the powerful idea it represented. The concept of a unified, centralized authority that could command the loyalty of millions. Into this space moved the tribal confederations that had been living on the empire's fringes for centuries, groups like the Franks in the north, the Visigoths in Spain, and the Ostrogoths preparing to move into Italy. They were not primitive destroyers, they were savvy political players who had often served as Roman allies and mercenaries. They understood the prestige and the practical power that came with the Roman title. But their own traditions were built on something very different, the personal bond between a warrior and his chieftain. This created a fundamental tension that would define the next 500 years. Could you graft the Roman idea of a state, a territory based on law and administration, onto a society where loyalty was a personal gift given to a man, not an institution? The answer would be attempted not by philosophers but by families. In this fragmented, competitive arena, survival and expansion depended on the strength of a single royal lineage. A king's passing could shatter his realm if his sons fought each other, or if no strong heir existed. Thus, the most urgent project for any successful warlord was not just conquering land, but forging a dynasty, a family machine capable of holding that land together across generations. This was the raw, unstable material of early medieval politics, a world where the map was literally redrawn with every succession, waiting for a family with the vision and the force to make their name stick to the land itself. Out of that fractured inheritance, one family learned to wield both the sword and the symbol with brutal efficiency. They were the Merovingians, a dynasty whose very identity was rooted in a visible, almost magical sign of power, their long, flowing hair which was never cut. This was no mere fashion statement, it was a sacred claim, a physical manifestation of a divine right to rule that set them apart from all other warriors and chieftains. The man who transformed this tribal mystique into a continental empire was Clovis I. His story begins not with a crown, but with a small, ambitious Frankish kingdom in what is now northern France and Belgium, one petty realm among many. But Clovis possessed a ruthless political instinct that his rivals lacked. His most calculated move came in the year 496, following a desperate prayer during a difficult battle. He chose to be baptized not into the Arian Christian faith common among other Germanic tribes, but into the mainstream Catholic Christianity of the Gallo-Roman population he now ruled. This was a masterstroke of political branding. Overnight, he ceased to be a foreign conqueror in the eyes of the local elite and the powerful bishops who controlled the cities. Instead, he became their most Catholic champion, a king anointed by God to protect the faith. The Church, in return, offered him something priceless, a sacred legitimacy that his pagan ancestors could never have claimed. With this new divine mandate, Clovis's campaigns took on the character of a holy unification. He turned his armies against neighboring Frankish kings, his own relatives, and the Visigothic kingdom to the south, consolidating territory through a mix of battlefield victory, strategic alliance, and outright betrayal. By the time of his passing, he had forged a single Frankish realm that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, the first major political entity to emerge from the Roman wreckage in the west. Yet, the very system that enabled this rapid expansion contained the seeds of its own fragmentation. For the Merovingians, the kingdom was not an abstract state. It was the personal property of the royal family, to be divided like any other inheritance. Upon Clovis's death, his realm was split among his 4 sons. Sometimes these brothers cooperated for a new conquest, but just as often, they turned on each other, plunging the kingdom into repeated civil wars that drained its strength. This pattern, division, warfare, and temporary reunification under a single strong ruler, only to be divided again, became the exhausting rhythm of Merovingian rule. It was a system that guaranteed every generation would face the same internal fracture, treating the map of Europe not as a sacred trust, but as a family estate to be carved up at every succession. This cycle of creation and fragmentation would define the political landscape for centuries, until another family arose with a radically different idea for how to hold an empire together. The long-haired Merovingian kings eventually became known as the do-nothing kings, rulers in title only who retreated into the comforts of palace life. But a kingdom cannot run itself. Someone had to collect taxes, dispense justice, and most importantly, lead the armies. That someone was the mayor of the palace, a title that sounds like a glorified butler, but was in fact the most powerful office in the realm. While the king reigned with sacred, uncut hair, the mayor ruled with practical, administrative force. He controlled access to the royal treasury, commanded the military, and managed the vast estates that funded the kingdom. In essence, the mayor held the keys to the entire Frankish machine, and he did not need a crown to make it work. This created a fascinating and unstable duality, a visible king for ceremonial legitimacy and an invisible mayor for real power. It was only a matter of time before one of these powerful ministers decided to make his family's position permanent. That family was the Carolingians, and their patriarch, Charles Martel, did not just manage power, he earned it on the battlefield. His defining moment came in the year 732 near the city of Tours. A formidable Umayyad force had crossed the Pyrenees from the Iberian Peninsula, raiding deep into Frankish territory. Charles marched his army to intercept them. The battle was not a clash for imperial conquest, but a desperate fight to halt the advance. Charles's Frankish infantry, fighting in a dense, disciplined formation, held against repeated cavalry charges. The Umayyad commander fell, and his army withdrew south. In the grand narrative of Europe, this engagement was framed as the moment that saved Christendom, a turning point where one family stood as the bulwark against a tide. For Charles Martel, it was the ultimate source of legitimacy. He had done what the ceremonial Merovingian king could not. He had personally defended the realm. He was no longer just a mayor, he was the savior of Francia. This victory transformed the Carolingians from clever administrators into celebrated national heroes. They now possessed the three pillars needed to claim a throne: military glory, administrative control, and a sacred role as protectors of the faith. Charles never took the crown for himself. That final step would be left to his son. But he had masterfully demonstrated the blueprint for a dynastic takeover, not by storming the palace in a coup, but by patiently becoming so indispensable that the crown itself became an empty relic, waiting for the right family to finally claim it. The stage was now set for a coronation that would deliberately echo the grandeur of Rome itself, a symbolic act meant to erase the old dynasty's memory forever. The final, sacred step required a master of political theatre. Pepin the Short, the son of Charles Martel, inherited not just an army and an administration, but a throne that was functionally already his. Yet the visible symbol of kingship still rested with the last Merovingian, a powerless figure cloaked in ancient tradition. To simply seize the crown by force would make Pepin just another usurper in a long line of strongmen. His ambition was far greater. He wanted to found a new dynasty with a legitimacy so profound it would erase the old one from memory. To achieve this, he turned his gaze south to the spiritual authority of the Bishop of Rome. Pepin posed a deceptively simple question to Pope Zachary: who holds the right to be king, the man who merely bears the title, or the man who actually wields the power? The Pope's reply was a masterpiece of political theology. He declared it was better for the man with the power to also hold the title. With this papal decree, Pepin received something no Frankish king had ever possessed: the explicit blessing of Christianity's highest office to overthrow the old order. This was not a one-sided gift, it was a historic bargain. The Pope, facing severe military threats from Lombard kingdoms in Italy, needed a powerful protector. Pepin needed a sacred coronation. In the year 751, the last Merovingian king was peacefully tonsured, his long hair shorn, and sent to live out his days in a monastery. His sacred power was literally cut away. In his place, Pepin was anointed king not just by the Frankish nobles, but by the missionary Saint Boniface, using holy oil in a ceremony that echoed the biblical anointing of King David. This act transformed Frankish kingship forever. No longer was authority based solely on tribal loyalty or battlefield success. It was now imbued with a divine charge, a sacred office granted by God through his church. Pepin promptly upheld his end of the bargain, marching into Italy to defend papal lands, an intervention that created the Papal States and forged an unbreakable bond between the Carolingian dynasty and the papacy. This alliance redrew the map of influence as decisively as any war. A new political geography was born, one where spiritual authority and royal power were permanently intertwined, setting a precedent that would shape European politics for 1,000 years. With this sacred foundation firmly laid, the stage was now set for a ruler who would use it to build an empire that consciously, deliberately, reached back to the glory of Rome itself. Charlemagne's ambition was as vast as the continent itself. He was not content to merely rule a kingdom. He sought to forge an empire in the old Roman mold, but one reborn under the sign of the cross. His method was relentless, decades-long campaigning that pushed the borders of the Frankish world in every direction. To the south, he conquered the Lombard kingdom of Italy, finally securing the papacy's safety and fulfilling his father's promise on a grander scale. To the northeast, he waged a brutal 30-year war to subdue the pagan Saxons, a conflict as much about forced conversion as territorial control. To the southwest, he established a military buffer zone, the Spanish March, to guard against any future incursions. The map was being physically redrawn by the march of his armies, creating a unified block of territory that stretched from the Baltic coast to central Italy, and from the Atlantic to the edges of the Slavic world. This was no longer the fractured Francia of old. It was a true empire requiring a new kind of administration. To govern this colossal domain, Charlemagne relied on a network of trusted nobles, his counts, and a system of traveling inspectors, the missi dominici, who acted as his eyes and ears, ensuring his laws were followed from one frontier to the other. Yet Charlemagne understood that an empire needed more than laws and soldiers. It required a soul. His court at Aachen became the heart of a remarkable cultural project, later called the Carolingian Renaissance. He gathered the finest scholars from across Europe, men like Alcuin of York, to standardize Latin, preserve ancient texts, and reform education within the Church. This was a conscious effort to revive the learning and administrative unity of the Roman past, creating a class of literate clergy and officials who could run a Christian empire. All of this, the conquests, the laws, the cultural revival, was a meticulous preparation for a single, world-altering event. On Christmas Day in the year 800, in the Great Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, Charlemagne knelt in prayer. Pope Leo Roman III stepped forward and placed a golden crown upon his head, proclaiming him Emperor of the Romans. The assembled crowd roared its approval, but the moment was shrouded in deliberate mystery. Did Charlemagne know the Pope would do this, or was he, as some chroniclers later claimed, surprised by the act? The truth is less important than the profound symbolism. This was not a mere coronation, it was a seismic political statement. The Pope, by his own authority, had declared the imperial throne of the West, vacant for over 3 centuries, to be filled once more. He had transferred the sacred mantle of Rome from the distant, Greek-speaking emperor in Constantinople to a Frankish king in the heart of Europe. With one gesture, Leo III and Charlemagne forged a new political map, one where spiritual and temporal power were fused together to define a new Christian empire. This act created a standard, a shining ideal of unified Christendom under a single emperor, that would haunt and inspire every ruler who came after. It also planted the seeds for immense future conflict, for who ultimately held the authority to grant such a crown, the Pope or the Emperor himself? The answer to that question would fracture the very landscape Charlemagne had worked so hard to unite. A crown forged by a pope could not bind together an empire built by one man. The immense realm Charlemagne assembled was a masterpiece of personal authority, held together by the force of his will, the loyalty of his warriors, and the sheer momentum of his campaigns. But an empire is not a monument, it is a living system, and the system he inherited was still based on that ancient Frankish tradition, the idea that a kingdom was family property to be divided among legitimate heirs. This fundamental tension between the dream of a unified Christian empire and the reality of dynastic inheritance would shatter his life's work within a single generation. Upon his passing, the crown passed to his sole surviving son, Louis the Pious, a ruler more devoted to religious unity than to the brutal pragmatics of power. Louis's own reign was consumed by rebellions led by his sons, each eager to secure their portion of the inheritance while he still lived. The dream of unity died in a series of bitter civil wars, pitting brother against brother in a struggle that drained the empire's wealth and fractured its nobility into competing factions. The final, decisive division came not on a battlefield, but around a negotiation table in the year 843, with the signing of the Treaty of Verdun. The 3 surviving grandsons of Charlemagne, weary of conflict, agreed to a formal split. They carved the Carolingian Empire into 3 separate kingdoms, an act of political surgery that would permanently alter the anatomy of Europe. Lothair, the eldest, kept the imperial title and received the Middle Kingdom, a long, sprawling corridor of land running from the North Sea down through the Low Countries, Burgundy, and into northern Italy. Louis the German received East Francia, the lands largely east of the Rhine River. Charles the Bald took West Francia, the territories to the west. On a map, this division might look like a simple administrative decision, but its consequences were geological. It created distinct political cores that would develop in profound isolation from one another. The Eastern and Western kingdoms, separated by that vast middle strip, began to cultivate their own languages, their own legal traditions, and their own separate identities. The Treaty of Verdun did not just end a war, it planted the seeds for nations that did not yet exist. Most critically, it established the rough territorial framework for what would become, centuries later, the perennial rivals of Europe, France, and Germany. The Middle Kingdom, however, was a geopolitical phantom, a territory with no natural unity, destined to be fought over and pulled apart by its stronger neighbors for the next 1,000 years. In one diplomatic agreement, the ideal of a unified Christendom under one emperor was shattered, replaced by a fractured map of competing dynasties. The great Carolingian project was over, but from its broken pieces, a new, more complex puzzle of Europe began to take shape, one where family ambition would now play out on a stage of separate, hardening kingdoms. The Eastern Kingdom carved out at Verdun faced a future of fragmentation. With the Carolingian bloodline there extinguished in the early 10th century, central authority simply evaporated. Power flowed not to a king but to the great tribal dukes, the leaders of Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and Lorraine. They ruled their own territories as near-independent princes, raising armies and collecting taxes. The title of king became almost an afterthought, a ceremonial prize to be rotated among them. This was not a map of a nation, but a patchwork of competing mini-kingdoms, a recipe for perpetual weakness. Yet from this seeming chaos, a new order would be forged, one that would permanently shift the center of European power. The man who began this reversal was Henry the Fowler, Duke of Saxony. He was elected king not through divine right, but through a pragmatic deal with his fellow dukes, a recognition that someone needed to lead against the existential threat pressing in from the east. That threat was the Magyars, nomadic horsemen whose lightning raids had terrorized Central Europe for decades, reaching deep into the German lands, even into Francia and Italy. Henry's first task was not glorious conquest, but grim, practical defense. He built a network of fortified towns, burghs, where populations could gather for safety, and he reorganized the Saxon cavalry into a more effective force. He bought time, but the decisive blow would be struck by his son. Otto I inherited a kingdom still perilously divided, its dukes ever watchful for a chance to reclaim their autonomy. His early reign was consumed by rebellions from his own family members and rival dukes, but Otto possessed a relentless strategic mind and a profound sense of royal destiny. He crushed these revolts not just to punish, but to systematically dismantle the old ducal power structure. He placed loyal family members in key positions, and most innovatively, he leaned heavily on the church. He appointed bishops and abbots as royal administrators, granting them lands and authority. These were ideal agents, they were educated, they could not found hereditary dynasties to rival his own, and their loyalty was directly to the crown that appointed them. This church-state partnership became the bedrock of Ottoman rule. With his realm finally secured, Otto could turn to the Magyar menace. In the year 955, on the Lechfeld plain near Augsburg, he confronted the raiding Magyar force. This was no border skirmish, it was a battle for the survival of his kingdom. Otto deployed his troops with brilliant discipline, using the terrain and his heavy infantry to negate the Magyar cavalry's mobility. The victory was total, shattering the Magyar threat forever and earning Otto the title the Great. He was now the undisputed savior of Christendom in the East. But Otto's vision stretched beyond defense. Like Charlemagne before him, he looked south to Italy, drawn by its wealth and, crucially, by the imperial crown. When the Pope appealed for help against local Italian adversaries, Otto answered the call. He marched into Italy, restored papal authority, and in a deliberate echo of that Christmas day in 800, Pope John XII crowned him emperor in 962. This coronation was not a mere revival, it was a rebirth with a new geography. The empire was now firmly anchored in the German lands, no longer in Francia. This Ottoman Empire, which would evolve into the Holy Roman Empire, demonstrated a profound truth. A new dynasty, rising from the fractured pieces of the old Carolingian map, could forge its own imperial destiny. It recentered European power eastward, creating a political entity that would stand, in some form, for nearly 1,000 years, a testament to the enduring power of a family's name when stamped upon the land. While the Ottonians were building an empire in the east, the Western Kingdom faced a very different kind of crisis. West Francia, the realm of Charles the Bald, was a landscape dissolving into chaos. The last Carolingian kings found their authority hollowed out from within by regional lords who built private castles and raised private armies, and battered from without by relentless Viking raids that sailed up its rivers with impunity. The crown had become a liability, a symbol of weakness passed between competing branches of a fading family. By the late 10th century, the great nobles of the realm faced a stark choice: continue with a figurehead who could not protect them, or elect a new king who at least promised stability. In the year 987, they made their decision. They passed over the last Carolingian heir and chose Hugh Capet, the Duke of the Franks, a man respected more for his solid reliability than for any sweeping imperial vision. His coronation was not a glorious rebirth, but a pragmatic experiment. Hugh's direct royal domain was shockingly small, a narrow strip of territory called the Isle de France, centered on the towns of Paris and Orleans. He was, in effect, a king who ruled a little more land than many of the powerful counts who had elected him. This was not an empire, it was a precarious foothold. Yet the Capetians possessed two subtle instruments of power far stronger than any army they could initially field. The first was the sacred aura of kingship itself, the anointed office they now held. Even a weak king was still the king, a figure who presided over great ceremonies, who symbolized justice, and who, crucially, could claim to be God's chosen representative. This spiritual authority gave their decrees a weight that a duke's commands could never match. Their second, masterful innovation was their approach to succession. They abandoned the old Frankish tradition of dividing the kingdom among all sons. Instead, they adopted the principle of primogeniture, ensuring the crown and the entire royal domain passed intact to the eldest surviving son. This was a strategy of breathtaking patience, designed not for one lifetime, but for a dozen. While a German emperor might spend his reign putting down rebellions from rival dukes, a Capetian king worked quietly to expand his personal holdings, one castle, one marriage, one legal claim at a time. They used their position as feudal overlords to reclaim lands from nobles who died without a clear heir. They strategically married their sons to heiresses of great duchies. They supported towns and the church, building a base of loyal support outside the fractious nobility. It was a slow, relentless process of accumulation, more like the steady drip of water shaping stone than the hammer blow of conquest. Over 3 centuries, this unwavering strategy transformed the map. The scattered, independent patches of feudal territory were gradually absorbed into the royal domain, like ink spreading on parchment. The word France began to shift from a vague geographical term into the name of a unified kingdom, its identity increasingly tied to the Capetian monarch in Paris. Here was a new model of state building, one that proved dynastic power could be woven through persistence and bureaucracy as effectively as through the sword. This quiet, relentless consolidation in the West would eventually create a counterpart to the empire in the East, setting the stage for a continental rivalry that would define the next chapter of European history. The story of dynastic power unfolds differently on an island. While continental families battled over the corpse of Rome, the map of early medieval Britain was being written from scratch. Following the Roman legion's withdrawal in the 5th century, Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes crossed the North Sea in a long, slow migration. They did not find an empty land, but they did establish their own new political order atop it, a patchwork of small, fiercely competitive kingdoms. By the 7th century, this had crystallized into a system historians call the Heptarchy, the rule of 7. Names like Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia emerged from the mist, each with its own royal family, its own history, and its own ambition. These were not nations in any modern sense, but territories defined by the reach of a king's warriors and the loyalty of his nobles. Their rivalry was constant, a simmering contest for land, tribute, and prestige. The ultimate prize was a title that spoke to a grander vision, Bretwalda, a term meaning Britain ruler or wide ruler. It was less a formal crown and more an acknowledgement of temporary overlordship, a recognition by other kings that one among them was preeminent, capable of leading combined forces or commanding tribute. A Mercian king might hold the title for a generation, only for a powerful Northumbrian ruler to claim it next. This endless competition kept the political map of Britain fluid, a landscape where borders shifted with the fortunes of its ruling families. Then from the sea came a force that shattered this internal game entirely. Beginning in the late 8th century, Viking raiders struck the British coast with terrifying speed. These were not migrants seeking land, at least not at first, but warriors seeking portable wealth. They targeted the rich, undefended monasteries that dotted the coastline, but their ambitions quickly grew. By the mid-9th century, what had been seasonal raids transformed into full-scale invasion and settlement. Great Viking armies, known as the Great Heathen Army, moved inland, conquering kingdom after kingdom. The kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia were systematically destroyed, their royal lines extinguished or driven into exile. The Vikings carved out a vast territory in the north and east of England, an area governed by their own laws and customs, known as the Danelaw. In a single generation, the Heptarchy was reduced to ruins. Only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom held firm, pushed to the very brink but refusing to break. That kingdom was Wessex, and its king was a young man named Alfred. When he came to the throne, his realm was the last redoubt of independent Anglo-Saxon rule, a shrinking territory harried by Viking forces. After a devastating surprise attack forced him into hiding in the marshes of Athelney, Alfred regrouped with a revolutionary strategy. He reorganized his army, creating a rotating system that allowed part of his forces to always be in the field while others tended their farms. He built a network of fortified towns, burhs, across Wessex, creating strongpoints that could shelter the population and stall Viking advances. Most importantly, he understood that survival required more than military innovation. It demanded a cultural and spiritual revival to unite his people. Alfred promoted learning, had key Latin texts translated into Old English, and framed the struggle not just as a fight for land, but as a defense of Christian civilization itself. His victory at the Battle of Edington in 878 was a turning point. It did not drive the Vikings from Britain, but it forced their leader, Guthrum, to accept baptism and a treaty that established a formal border between Wessex and the Danelaw. Alfred had secured his kingdom's existence. From this fragile foothold, he and his descendants began a meticulous project of reconquest and integration. They styled themselves not merely as kings of Wessex, but as kings of the Anglo-Saxons, a title that claimed authority over all English people living outside Viking control. This was the crucial pivot, the moment when external, existential pressure forged a new dynastic mission. The old competition for the title of Bretwalda was over, replaced by a single family's claim to lead a unified resistance, a claim that would slowly, over the next century, redraw the map of Britain into a single kingdom of England. The final, dramatic forging of the English map came from across the water. While the House of Wessex had painstakingly united the land, their claim to the throne was about to be challenged by a rival dynasty forged in a different crucible entirely, the Normans. These were the descendants of Viking raiders who had settled in northern France a century before, adopting the French language and Christian faith, but never losing their ferocious appetite for conquest and meticulous organization. Their leader, Duke William of Normandy, was a man of relentless ambition and legalistic cunning. He based his claim to England not on some abstract right of conquest, but on a contested promise of inheritance. He asserted that his distant cousin, the childless King Edward the Confessor, had named him heir years before, and that the newly crowned Anglo-Saxon king, Harold Godwinson, had sworn an oath to support his claim. When Harold took the crown, William framed it as a sacred betrayal. He secured a papal banner, framing his invasion as a holy crusade to correct a perjury. The Norman landing in the autumn of 1066 was the opening move in a high-stakes dynastic gamble. The clash at Hastings that October was not merely a battle, it was a brutal, day-long negotiation over who would write the next chapter of English history. Harold's death on the field settled the question with finality. William the Conqueror, as he would be known, had seized the crown through sheer force of will. But holding it required something far more systematic than battlefield valor. What followed was not just a change of ruler, but an administrative revolution that would recast the very bones of the kingdom. William moved with chilling efficiency to dismantle the old Anglo-Saxon power structure. The existing aristocracy, those who had fought for Harold or who resisted his rule, were systematically dispossessed. Their vast estates were confiscated and redistributed as rewards to the Norman barons and knights who had followed him across the Channel. This was a total replacement of the ruling class. Within a generation, almost every major landholding in England was in the hands of a new Norman lord, bound by feudal oath directly to the king. To consolidate this new order, William engineered a masterpiece of bureaucratic control. 2 decades after the conquest, he ordered a survey of his new kingdom so comprehensive it stunned his contemporaries. Royal commissioners traveled to every shire, gathering detailed information on every piece of land, who held it, what it was worth before 1066, what it was worth now, and how many peasants, plows, and livestock were there. The result was the Domesday Book, a written testament of possession and value. For the king, it was a financial ledger and a tool of power, a way to know exactly what his kingdom could yield in tax and military service. For the people recorded in its pages, it was a final, authoritative record of the new Norman reality, inescapable as law. This created a new kind of state, a centralized feudal monarchy where the king's authority reached, through his barons and his own officials, into every village in the land. Yet this very success forged a complex new geography of power. William and his successors were now both kings of England and dukes of Normandy. They ruled a cross-channel realm, an Anglo-Norman entity that intricately tied the destiny of England to the tangled web of French dynastic politics. The English crown was now a continental player, its kings often more concerned with defending or expanding their French territories than governing their island kingdom. This dual identity would plant the seeds for a conflict that would last for centuries, a relentless tug of war between a kingdom and a continent, all born from the ambition of one family on a bloody field in 1066. South of the Pyrenees, the map was being drawn by a different kind of fire. The Iberian Peninsula in the early medieval centuries was not a contest between two sides, but a complex mosaic of many. For nearly 800 years, a dynamic tension defined its geography, a slow, grinding process of expansion and contraction known as the Reconquista. In the south lay the sophisticated, powerful Muslim state of Al-Andalus, a beacon of learning and culture. To the north, a collection of small, rugged Christian kingdoms clung to the mountainous fringe, their survival an act of daily defiance. This was not a simple, linear holy war, but a protracted frontier struggle where the very identities of kingdoms were forged in the constant press against a border. The northern realms, Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, and later Portugal, were siblings in faith but fierce rivals in ambition. They shared a common enemy, but they also shared a hunger for the fertile lands to the south. Their relationship was a perpetual dance of alliance and betrayal. They would unite their armies for a great campaign against a Muslim Taifa kingdom, only to turn on each other the moment the spoils were divided, fighting over a captured fortress or a stretch of valuable pastureland. Kingdoms fractured and reformed, Castile breaking from Leon, Portugal asserting its independence from Leon and Castile. Each new border was a statement of dynastic pride. The primary engine of expansion was not just the knight's charge, but the farmer's plow. After a military advance, kings encouraged settlers from the north to move into the newly secured territories, a process called repopulation. These communities, granted special freedoms and land rights, solidified the conquest, turning contested frontier zones into permanent parts of the Christian realm. The map crept southward through a combination of sudden, dramatic victories and this slow, steady seepage of people. In this competitive environment, dynastic marriage became a weapon as strategic as any siege engine. A well-arranged wedding could secure a decades-long peace between rival kingdoms, combine military resources for a major push, or, most significantly, lay the groundwork for a permanent union. The most fateful of these unions was between two young rulers, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Their marriage in 1469 was a masterstroke of political calculation, merging the two most powerful crowns in the peninsula. It created a combined force that could pursue the final act of the Reconquista with unprecedented focus. In 1492, their armies captured the last Muslim stronghold of Granada. That same year, they issued an edict expelling all Jews from their united kingdoms, a tragic decision that sought religious uniformity at a terrible human cost. While their campaign for religious unity casts a long shadow, their political achievement redrew the map decisively. The union of their crowns created the kernel of modern Spain, demonstrating how a shared, centuries-old project could finally compel rival dynasties to unite, using the bonds of matrimony to complete what the sword had begun. This peninsular crucible proved that the forging of a nation could be the final, calculated move in a dynasty's long game of survival and ambition. The crown's authority was sacred, but who held the right to grant that sacredness? While kings fought to imprint their family names upon the land, another power in Rome was mastering the art of imprinting legitimacy itself. The papacy was far more than a spiritual institution. It was a formidable political dynasty in its own right, one that did not rule a kingdom so much as it ruled the very idea of Christian kingship. For centuries, the chair of St. Peter was contested by the great aristocratic clans of Rome, families like the Theophylacti, who treated the papal office as a hereditary prize to be controlled across generations. These families installed popes, influenced their decrees, and used the immense spiritual authority of the office to build vast networks of wealth and political patronage right in the heart of the old empire. This meant the pope was often a player in the dynastic game, not merely its referee. His ultimate weapons were not armies, but spiritual sanctions that could shake a kingdom to its foundations. Excommunication could cut off a ruler from the sacraments, declaring them outside the community of the faithful. An interdict could suspend all religious services across an entire realm, placing immense psychological pressure on a monarch's subjects. But the most potent tool was the positive one, the power to crown. By placing the imperial diadem on the head of a Charlemagne or an Otto the Great, a pope was performing a transformative act. He was transferring the sacred mantle of Rome, declaring that this particular family's rule was divinely ordained. This made the papacy the ultimate kingmaker, a power broker whose alliance could elevate a dynasty or whose opposition could cripple it. A papal blessing could turn a regional warlord into a Christian emperor, while a papal condemnation could turn his own nobles against him. This delicate, often explosive, partnership between royal and papal power reached its breaking point in a conflict known as the Investiture Controversy. At its heart, it was a dynastic struggle over control of the map. The issue was deceptively simple: who had the right to appoint bishops and abbots, the emperor or the pope? But these were not just religious posts. Bishops were great feudal lords controlling vast estates, raising troops, and administering justice. Whoever appointed them controlled a web of loyalties, wealth, and military force that spanned the empire. Pope Gregory VII, a fierce reformer, declared that only the Church could invest these spiritual officers. The German Emperor Henry IV saw this as a direct assault on his royal authority, his very ability to govern. The clash that followed was a masterclass in political theater. Henry had Gregory deposed. Gregory responded by excommunicating Henry and absolving his subjects of their oaths of loyalty. The emperor, facing rebellion from his own nobles, was forced into a legendary act of penance. In the bitter winter of 1077, Henry stood for 3 days barefoot in the snow outside the castle of Canossa, begging the Pope for forgiveness. Gregory eventually lifted the excommunication, but the political victory was fleeting. The struggle continued for decades, fundamentally altering the landscape of power. The eventual compromise, the Concordat of Worms in 1122, formally divided the symbolic act of investiture, granting the Church spiritual authority while allowing secular rulers a role in granting temporal lands. The real legacy was a new map of loyalty. It drew a clearer, if still contested, line between the authority of the crown and the authority of the Church. It demonstrated that the deepest fractures in medieval Europe were not always between rival kingdoms, but could run straight through the very heart of the alliance between the throne and the altar, a crack opened by two men fighting over who truly held the keys to a kingdom's soul. A wedding could be more decisive than a war. Across the fractured map of medieval Europe, the most durable borders were often not drawn with a sword, but with a marriage contract. Dynastic union was the ultimate diplomatic instrument, a way to bind kingdoms together with the literal and symbolic ties of blood. When Ferdinand of Aragon married Isabella of Castile, they did not just join two hearts, they fused two crowns, merging military resources, treasuries, and legal authority to forge a new political entity. This was the ideal, a peaceful accretion of power that expanded a realm without the cost and chaos of battle. A single, well-planned ceremony could accomplish what decades of campaigning could not, weaving separate territories into a personal union under one ruling house. But the same thread that could stitch a map together could also become a snarled knot of conflict for generations. Consider the legacy of Elena of Aquitaine. Her marriage first to the King of France and then, after an annulment, to the future King of England, transferred her vast and wealthy duchy of Aquitaine from French to English control. This single marital transaction planted a legal claim that grew into a towering tree of war. For centuries, English kings, as descendants of Elena and her Plantagenet husband, would assert their right to the French crown itself, a dynastic argument that fueled the long, devastating conflict we call the 100 Years' War. What began as a union of two individuals spiraled into a struggle between two nations, proving that a wedding vow could be a promissory note for future bloodshed. These strategic marriages created a dense, continent-wide web of kinship. Kings were not just neighbors, they were cousins, brothers-in-law, uncles, and nephews. The royal families of England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Iberian kingdoms were all intricately interlinked. This network was meant to foster peace through family loyalty, but it could just as easily complicate every dispute. A quarrel between two monarchs was now a bitter family feud, laden with personal grievance. It also meant that claims to thrones could pop up in unexpected places, as the family tree itself became a map of potential inheritances waiting to be activated. The most spectacular successes of this system were the composite states, empires assembled through matrimony rather than conquest. The Crown of Aragon did not just rule in Spain. Through a series of strategic marriages, it came to control Sicily, Sardinia, and parts of Greece, creating a sprawling Mediterranean empire held together by the personal authority of its king. Yet this personal nature was also the fatal weakness. The entire brilliant, fragile structure depended on the biological continuity of the dynasty. The failure to produce a surviving heir or the birth of too many with competing claims could shatter a realm as swiftly as it was built. Succession crises turned brother against brother, plunging united kingdoms back into civil war and partition. Thus, the family tree was not just a record of lineage, it was a living, breathing blueprint for the political map, its branches representing alliances, its splits Chinese letter future fractures. In the end, the most carefully laid plans of kings and popes could be undone by something as simple and as uncontrollable as the birth or the absence of a child. The law of the land was often at war with the law of the family. Across many early medieval cultures, a deeply ingrained sense of fairness dictated that a father's property should be shared by all his sons. This practice, known as partible inheritance or sometimes by names like gavelkind, was not seen as a weakness but as a rightful duty. A kingdom, in this view, was simply the grandest form of family estate, a collection of farms, forests, and fortresses to be distributed like any other inheritance. It was a logical system in a world where loyalty was personal, where a warrior followed his specific lord, not an abstract nation, but the political consequences were predictable and relentless. Each generation faced the same centrifugal force, pulling a unified realm apart into competing brother kingdoms. We saw this cycle play out with devastating regularity, from the Merovingians splitting Clovis's empire 4 ways to the grandsons of Charlemagne carving up his colossal achievement at Verdun. The map was not just contested between dynasties, it was routinely divided within them. This created a paradox where the very act of building a legacy through conquest guaranteed its fragmentation upon the ruler's passing. The realm was not a state, it was a temporary constellation of power that would rearrange itself with every royal succession. Against this powerful tradition, a new and counterintuitive principle slowly gained ground: primogeniture. This was the rule that the entire inheritance, the crown and all the lands attached to it, should pass intact to the eldest surviving son. To modern eyes, this seems blatantly unfair, disinheriting younger siblings. But from the perspective of political survival, it was a revolutionary strategy. It prioritized the stability and continuity of the kingdom over the immediate claims of each royal prince. A realm that remained whole was stronger, richer, and better able to defend itself. It gave the ruling dynasty a fighting chance to build something lasting. The adoption of primogeniture was not a sudden change, but a slow, grinding shift in mindset. It required kings and their nobles to begin thinking of the crown as a sacred office, a trust for the entire people, rather than as private property. It demanded that younger sons accept a different fate, perhaps a wealthy dukedom or a high church position, instead of an independent kingdom of their own. This struggle between division and unity, between family custom and political necessity, was one of the quietest yet most decisive battles in the forging of Europe. Where partible inheritance prevailed, as in the early Frankish realms, maps remained fluid and fractured. Where primogeniture took root, as with the Capetians in France, it provided the structural skeleton for a unified state to slowly coalesce. The choice a dynasty made about this single legal principle could determine whether its name would be remembered as the founder of a nation, or merely as one branch on a family tree of endless squabbling kings. The true power of a king was measured not by the lines on a map, but by the strength of his handshakes. Across the splintered landscape of early medieval Europe, the most vital political structure was not the kingdom itself, but a vast, personal network of sworn promises known as the feudal system. This was a world where authority was not downloaded from a central government, but radiated outward from thousands of individual relationships, each one a private contract of loyalty and service. At its heart was a solemn public ceremony called homage. A man, the vassal, would kneel before his lord, place his hands between the lord's hands, and swear an oath of fealty, a promise to be faithful. In return, the lord would grant his vassal a fief, most often a parcel of land, along with the right to govern the people living on it. This exchange was the fundamental building block of society. It was how armies were raised, how lands were managed, and how order was maintained in an age without standing police forces or vast bureaucracies. But this elegant chain of command created a deeply fragmented map of power. A king was at the top of this pyramid, but his direct vassals were not obedient civil servants. They were mighty regional dynasts in their own right. Think of the Duke of Normandy or the Count of Flanders. They held their own courts, minted their own coins, and led their own armies, all drawn from their own web of sub-vassals. Their loyalty to the king was a personal bond, not an institutional duty. This meant the theoretical kingdom of France or Germany existed in one layer, while the practical, day-to-day reality of power existed in another, a patchwork of semi-independent regional states. A peasant in Aquitaine might feel the immediate authority of his duke long before he ever considered the distant king of France. The map, therefore, was not a single political entity but a complex overlay of multiple competing loyalties. This system placed immense pressure on the person of the king. His ability to forge a cohesive realm depended almost entirely on his personal character, his political skill, and his ability to manage these rival magnate families. A strong, charismatic king like William the Conqueror could command the loyalty of his barons through a mix of respect, fear, and the shared rewards of conquest. But a weak or young king could quickly find his authority ignored. A powerful vassal, if he felt slighted or saw an opportunity, could withhold his military service or even raise his banner in rebellion, turning his slice of the kingdom into a private war zone. The feudal map was thus inherently unstable, a delicate equilibrium maintained by constant negotiation, gift-giving, and the threat of force. It meant that the project of uniting a kingdom was less about conquering new territory and more about the endless, subtle work of binding the hearts of the men who already controlled it. Even the strongest dynastic walls could be shattered by a storm from beyond. While royal families vied for control of the European heartland, a trio of external forces struck its edges with terrifying force, not to claim a throne but to plunder its very foundations. From the north came the Vikings in their swift longships, masters of the sudden, shocking raid. They did not just attack armies, they targeted the soft underbelly of the Carolingian world, its wealthy, undefended monasteries and riverine trading towns. Their hit-and-run tactics completely bypassed the slow, land-based armies of the Frankish kings, exposing a fatal flaw in the empire's design. The psychological impact was profound. No coastal community was safe. Over time, these raids evolved into something more permanent. The Vikings began to overwinter, building fortified camps and ultimately settling. The most famous of these settlements would become the Duchy of Normandy, a land gifted to a Viking leader named Rollo by a desperate Frankish king in the hope it would make him a defender of the coast rather than its scourge. This was the invasion's ultimate paradox. It could create new dynasties even as it destroyed old orders. From the east swept the Magyar horsemen, a whirlwind of nomadic cavalry that poured through the fragile frontiers of East Francia and northern Italy. Their raids were not for settlement but for systematic extraction of treasure and slaves. They moved with a speed that the fragmented post-Carolingian kingdoms could not match, striking deep into Bavaria, Swabia, and even as far as Burgundy. Their success was a brutal audit of royal power, revealing the stark weakness of a realm divided among squabbling dukes. A king who could not protect his people from such terror forfeited their loyalty. And from the south, Saracen forces, based from strongholds in the Mediterranean, launched piratical raids on the coasts of Italy and southern France, even establishing a fortified base at Fraxintum in Provence. They disrupted trade, captured hostages, and served as a constant reminder that Christendom was under pressure from multiple directions at once. These invasions did more than burn villages, they fractured the perceived order of the world itself. Yet, in the chaos, they presented a supreme test and, for some families, a golden opportunity. A dynasty that could effectively organize a defense transformed its very identity. Otto I's crushing victory over the Magyars at Lechfeld did not just secure borders, it forged his reputation as the savior of Christendom and provided the moral authority to claim the imperial crown. In England, Alfred of Wessex's brilliant defensive reorganization against the Vikings, his network of boroughs and his reformed army, allowed his family to position themselves not merely as kings of one region, but as the rightful leaders of all surviving Anglo-Saxons. In both cases, an existential external threat became the catalyst for unprecedented internal centralization. To survive, these rulers had to demand more resources, build more infrastructure, and command more direct loyalty from their nobles. The crisis of invasion, therefore, acted as a forge, hammering weaker political structures to pieces while tempering stronger ones into something new, harder, and far more capable of stamping a single family's name across the land. A king needed more than land and loyalty. He needed a story his subjects could see and touch. In a world where power was often personal and fleeting, the abstract lines of a realm had to be made sacred, tangible, and unforgettable. This was the profound purpose of the coronation, a ritual so potent it was believed to change a man's very nature. At its heart was the anointing with holy oil, a ceremony borrowed from the biblical ordination of priests and kings. This sacred oil, applied to the head, hands, and sometimes even the chest of the kneeling ruler, was understood as a literal transfer of divine grace. It transformed a mortal noble into a rex et sacerdos, a king and priest, a figure set apart, anointed by God himself. This was not a political promotion, it was a spiritual rebirth, making the king the living link between heaven and his people. The crown that followed was its visible seal, but the unseen anointing was the true source of his new, sacred authority. The objects used in this theater of power were far more than ornate decorations. Each piece of regalia was a dense symbol, a physical embodiment of an idea. The crown represented the eternal, circular nature of the office, outlasting any single wearer. The scepter was the rod of justice and command. The orb, surmounted by a cross, signified the ruler's duty to govern the Christian world under God's ultimate authority. Even the swords carried specific meanings, like the ceremonial sword of mercy, which denoted the king's power to show clemency. To hold these objects was to physically grasp the abstract duties of kingship. Their weight was the weight of office, their glitter a reflection of divine light meant to dazzle and command reverence. For a new dynasty, especially one that had risen through force or election, possessing ancient regalia could fast-track its legitimacy. A powerful example is the Holy Lance, a relic believed to contain a nail from the crucifixion. When the Ottoman dynasty came to power in East Francia, they actively promoted their possession of this sacred spear. It became a central part of their narrative, a tangible sign that God had chosen their family to protect Christendom and wield imperial power. This was not about the historical accuracy of the relic, but about the story it enabled. By claiming such an object, the Ottonians connected themselves to the deepest wellsprings of Christian history, wrapping their new rule in the aura of timeless, sacred tradition. They were not usurpers, they were inheritors of a divine mandate made manifest in steel and wood. Ultimately, this symbolic language was how a kingdom became real in the hearts of its people. Most subjects would never see the full extent of the royal domain on a map, nor would they ever meet their distant king in person, but they would hear descriptions of his glorious coronation, repeated by priests and minstrels. They might see an image of him enthroned, crowned and holding the scepter on a coin they used in the market. These symbols forged a collective identity, a shared mental picture of the realm embodied in one anointed figure. The crown ceased to be just gold and jewels, it became the kingdom itself. This symbolic power allowed dynastic authority to sink roots deeper than any castle wall, making the map not just a matter of borders and armies, but a sacred reality to be believed in generation after generation. While kings and emperors built their power on castles and crowns, another, quieter kind of empire was growing across the landscape, one whose walls were made of prayer and parchment. The great monastic houses of medieval Europe were not just spiritual retreats, they were formidable political and economic entities in their own right. When a king like Charlemagne or a noble family founded an abbey, it was an act of piety with a deeply strategic purpose. By donating vast tracts of land to a community of monks, they were not simply giving a gift, they were making a long-term investment in their dynasty's future, both in this world and the next. The prayers of the monks were believed to shorten a donor's time in purgatory, a spiritual insurance policy for the soul, but the earthly benefits were just as tangible. A thriving monastery on a contested frontier could act as a stabilizing force, a center of administration and economic development that effectively extended the ruler's influence into wild or newly conquered lands. The monks would clear forests, drain marshes, introduce advanced farming techniques, and attract settlers, turning wilderness into productive territory that could later be integrated into the kingdom. This system created a unique and powerful geography. Abbeys like Cluny in Burgundy or Saint Denis near Paris amassed enormous estates, sometimes scattered across hundreds of miles, given by generations of grateful or calculating benefactors. These lands were worked by peasant tenants, generating immense wealth from agriculture, vineyards, and wool production. The monastery became a local economic engine, a bank, a landlord, and a cultural hub all at once. Critically, these ecclesiastical territories often operated under a special legal status, enjoying exemptions from the taxes and judicial oversight of the local count or duke. They answered directly to the Pope and to their own abbots, creating islands of autonomy within the secular feudal map. A traveler journeying from one county to another might pass through a village ruled by a baron, then a stretch of forest owned by the king, and then enter the prosperous, orderly lands of an abbey, where the law and the rhythms of life were dictated by the monastic rule. This spiritual network wielded a soft power that could make or break dynasties. The chronicles written by monks in their scriptoriums shaped the official memory of kings, declaring some to be pious heroes and others tyrants. The flow of prayers and pilgrimages to a royal foundation like Saint Denis, which became the burial site for French kings, reinforced the sacred aura of the Capetian dynasty for centuries. Conversely, if a king angered the church, he might find the economic and moral support of these powerful institutions withdrawn. The monastic web, with its ultimate loyalty to Rome, added a profound layer of religious geography over the political one. It meant that the map of Europe was not only divided between the territories of rival families, but also interlaced with a separate, continent-spanning network of faith, learning, and wealth that answered to a higher celestial authority. This dual landscape of power, where the spiritual and the secular were in constant negotiation, reminds us that to understand the medieval map, we must look not only to the castles on the hilltops, but also to the quiet cloisters in the valleys, where the pen and the prayer book were as consequential as the sword. The most ambitious dynasties did not just fight for territory, they fought for a story. Their ultimate weapon was a profound idea that gave their conquests a cosmic purpose, a belief known as translatio imperii, the transfer of empire. This was not a simple historical observation, but a powerful prophecy of power in motion. It held that the mantle of universal rule, the supreme authority over the civilized world, was destined to travel westward from one great civilization to the next. The torch had passed from Babylon to Persia, from Persia to the empire of Alexander the Great, and from the Greeks to the ultimate model of order, Rome. When the Western Roman Empire faded, the great question for medieval rulers became a sacred riddle. Where had the empire gone? Who would be its next rightful bearer? Any family that could convincingly answer this question held a key to unimaginable legitimacy. This ideology transformed raw military ambition into a divine mission. A king was no longer merely expanding his personal domain. He was stepping into a role prepared for him by the very flow of history and God's will. His wars became a necessary process to gather the scattered pieces of the old empire and reassemble them under a new Christian banner. He was not a destroyer but a restorer. The coronation of Charlemagne on that Christmas day was the most dramatic enactment of this belief. In the eyes of his supporters and the Pope who crowned him, this was the moment translatio imperii became a living reality. The imperial authority had formally jumped from the Romans in Constantinople to the Franks in the heart of Europe. Charlemagne was not just a Frankish king with a big army. He was now the successor to Augustus and Constantine, the emperor of a renewed Roman world. This single symbolic act created a template, a precedent that would haunt every powerful ruler for centuries. It established that the imperial title was not extinct, but mobile, waiting to be claimed by a dynasty strong enough and pious enough to shoulder its burden. Later, when the Ottoman dynasty rose in Germany, their chroniclers and poets eagerly adopted the same narrative. They portrayed the shift of power from the Carolingian Franks to the Saxon Ottonians as the next logical step in this grand transfer. The empire had moved again, this time decisively eastward, anchoring itself in the German lands. This story provided the Holy Roman emperors with a ready-made answer to any critic. Their authority was not an accident of politics or birth. It was the current station in a historical relay race ordained by Providence itself. This belief directly influenced the map because it dictated who felt entitled to redraw it. A dynasty that embraced the idea of translatio imperii looked at the fractured post-Roman landscape and saw not independent kingdoms to respect, but lost provinces to reclaim. It justified campaigns of unification and absorption as a holy duty. The borders they sought were not merely strategic, they were the theoretical borders of a reborn Christian empire. This mindset fueled centuries of conflict between popes and emperors, and between emperors and regional kings, all arguing over who truly embodied this transferred authority. It was a dream of unity that, in practice, perpetuated division, as multiple powers claimed the same majestic legacy. The land itself became a parchment on which each aspiring dynasty tried to write the next chapter of this never-ending story, believing that if they could just conquer enough, they could make the map finally match the prophecy. The Angevin Empire was a dynasty stretched across a map, not a kingdom drawn upon it. It began not with a single conquest, but with a spectacular accumulation of titles through one man, Henry II. He inherited the English crown from his mother, the Empress Matilda, and the vast French duchies of Normandy and Anjou from his father. Then, through his marriage to Elena of Aquitaine, he gained control of her even larger and wealthier territories in southwestern France. In a breathtakingly short span, Henry ruled a constellation of lands that stretched from the Scottish border all the way to the Pyrenees. On a map, it looked like a colossal, cross-channel block that utterly dwarfed the modest royal domain of his feudal overlord, the King of France in Paris. But this was the crucial point. This was not an empire in any administrative sense. It was a personal federation, a collection of separate legal entities united only by the fact that one man, Henry Plantagenet, happened to wear all their different crowns and hold all their different ducal titles. The laws of England were not the laws of Aquitaine. The customs of Normandy were not the customs of Anjou. Each territory had its own nobility, its own traditions, and its own deep-seated local loyalties. Henry was a monarch in London, but in Bordeaux or Rouen he was a duke, a title that technically made him a vassal of the French king for those very lands. This created an impossible tension, a geographic and political paradox that would strain the dynasty to its breaking point. The sheer sprawl of the Angevin lands was their greatest weakness. To govern them, Henry became a perpetual traveler, a king in constant motion across his realms, dragging his court and his administration with him in a never-ending circuit to dispense justice, collect revenues, and remind his subjects of his presence. His famous energy was not just a personality trait, it was a logistical necessity for holding his personal union together. Yet even his formidable will could not overcome the centrifugal forces he had assembled. The most destructive rebellions he faced came not from foreign enemies, but from within his own family. His sons, Richard and John, backed by their mother Elena and encouraged by the French king, repeatedly rose against him, hungry for power and portions of their inheritance before he was ready to give them. This pattern of internal betrayal revealed the core instability. The Plantagenet realm was so vast that any disgruntled prince could find a territory to use as a base for revolt, and the King of France was always ready to fund and fuel such divisions to weaken his overpowerful vassal. The fracture was inevitable. It began with the loss of key territories under King John, but the final dismantling was a slow, century-long process conducted by the relentless Capetian kings of France. They used the feudal law that made the Plantagenets their vassals as a legal weapon, summoning English kings to their courts and then confiscating their French lands when they failed to appear. The Angevin Empire proved a profound lesson in medieval statecraft. A realm forged purely through dynastic accident and personal charisma, without a common identity or centralized institutions, could not withstand the focused pressure of a rival dynasty patiently building a true, centralized kingdom. The Plantagenets had assembled a dazzling jigsaw puzzle of territories, but the Capetians were slowly, brick by brick, building a nation. In the end, the map was redrawn not by the family that owned the most pieces, but by the one that could most permanently glue theirs together. The law was the true bedrock of the land. While kings came and went, the customs that governed a peasant's field, a merchant's contract, or a noble's inheritance formed the unshakable foundation of daily life. A dynasty did not just rule territory, it presided over a living tapestry of legal traditions, and its success often hinged on how skillfully it could weave those threads together. Each region developed its own distinct legal personality over generations. The Franks had their lex salica, a code that meticulously outlined everything from fines for theft to rules of royal succession. In England, a unique system was slowly crystallizing from the rulings of royal judges traveling on circuit, a body of precedent we now call common law. And on the Iberian frontier, towns and regions fiercely guarded their furos, special charters granted by kings that detailed their unique rights and local self-government. These were not just rule books, they were the very DNA of a community's identity, defining its relationship with authority, property, and justice. For a ruling family, administering this complex legal landscape was the most practical test of their legitimacy. A king who could reliably deliver justice, who upheld the cherished customs of a region, earned a loyalty far deeper than anyone by fear alone. he became the guarantor of a known and predictable order. But this created a profound challenge when dynastic inheritance suddenly yoked together territories with wildly different legal traditions. Imagine a ruler from a culture governed by Roman law inheriting a kingdom where local custom demanded trial by a jury of one's peers. Or a king accustomed to absolute royal authority trying to govern a town protected by an ancient fuero that gave its citizens the right to reject his tax collectors. The map in this light was not just a patchwork of colors for different realms, it was a mosaic of competing legal jurisdictions. A border was often less a line on the ground and more the invisible point where one set of customs ended and another began. This legal friction became a constant source of tension and, at times, rebellion. When a foreign dynasty inherited a territory, it wasn't just acquiring land and people, it was inheriting a pre-existing contract with those people, written in the language of their ancient rights. To ignore that contract was to invite fracture. The most astute dynasties understood this. They learned that forging unity did not always mean imposing a single, uniform law from above. Sometimes it meant the clever, strategic manipulation of these local identities. A king might confirm a town's cherished fuero in exchange for its military support. He might allow a conquered region to keep its traditional legal procedures, but insert his own officials to oversee the highest court. This was a delicate balancing act, respecting enough local custom to secure peace, while gradually weaving in threads of royal authority to strengthen the central tapestry. The dynasties that lasted were those who realized the land was not truly theirs until its laws, in some way, acknowledged their crown. A king's authority was written in the soil and stamped on silver. The glittering crowns and sacred oaths we have followed were only the visible surface of dynastic power. Beneath them lay a more practical foundation, the relentless control of wealth itself. A realm could not be forged from faith and loyalty alone. It required the steady flow of grain from fertile fields, the clink of coin in royal treasuries, and the silent passage of merchant ships along protected routes. The political map of rival families was, in truth, a direct tracing of a deeper economic map, one of resources, trade, and revenue. Any dynasty that forgot this simple truth would soon find its borders dissolving, no matter how noble its bloodline or how ancient its crown. Control began with the land itself, but not just any land. The most coveted territories were the great river valleys, the lifeblood arteries of the medieval world. The Seine, winding through the heart of the Isle de France, provided the agricultural surplus that sustained the early Capetian kings in Paris. The Rhine was not just a border for the Ottoman emperors, it was a liquid highway of commerce, carrying goods and taxes from the Alpine passes to the North Sea. And the Thames Valley formed the productive core of the Anglo-Saxon and later Norman kingdom in England, its rich soils feeding London and funding royal ambitions. These valleys were more than pretty landscapes, they were engines of surplus. The grain, wine, and wool they produced were the fundamental units of power, used to feed royal households, supply armies on campaign, and reward loyal followers. A dynasty that lost control of its breadbasket was a dynasty starving itself into irrelevance. Yet to turn that agricultural wealth into portable, spendable power, a ruler needed to tap into the networks of exchange. This is where control of trade routes became a strategic obsession. For the Ottonians, securing the Rhine trade meant dominating the great episcopal cities like Cologne and Mainz, where tolls could be collected and the flow of goods from Italy and Byzantium could be taxed. For the Norman kings of England, mastery of the English Channel after 1066 was not just a military necessity, it was an economic coup. It allowed them to profit from the lucrative wool trade with Flanders, turning the sheep pastures of England into a vast source of royal revenue. And far to the south, the Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa built their entire identities not on landed empires, but on controlling the sea lanes of the Mediterranean, becoming indispensable middlemen between East and West. These routes were the financial nervous system of Europe, and the dynasties that commanded its key nodes commanded the continent's purse strings. The most potent symbol of this economic sovereignty was small, metallic, and passed through every hand. The right to mint coins was a royal monopoly and a breathtaking piece of political propaganda. When a new king issued coinage, he was doing something far more profound than updating the currency. He was placing his own face, his name, and his symbols of authority into the daily transactions of every merchant, farmer, and artisan in his realm. Every time someone paid for a loaf of bread or a length of cloth with a silver penny bearing the king's image, they were physically acknowledging his rule. It was a constant, silent reinforcement of his legitimacy, an economic echo of the coronation oath. A rival power minting its own coins in your territory was not a financial challenge. It was a declaration of war by other means, a claim to economic and thus political independence. This is why dynastic conflicts so often centered on places that held little strategic glory but immense economic value. Wars were fought over silver mines in the Harz Mountains, which funded the Ottoman emperors. They were fought over the productive monastic estates of Burgundy, whose revenues could bankroll an army, and they were fought over narrow mountain passes and key river crossings, where a lord could erect a toll station and tax the commerce of an entire region. These were not side shows to the great drama of kings and popes, they were the main stage. The castle guarding a bridge was not just a fortress, it was a revenue collection point. The battle to control a fertile plain was a battle to control the harvest that would pay soldiers' wages next season. In the end, the landscape of dynasty was a double exposure. Overlaid on the map of kingdoms and duchies was a hidden map of wheat fields and vineyards, of sheep runs and silver veins, of bustling market towns and silent, lucrative tolls. A family could win a crown on the battlefield, but it could only keep that crown if it mastered the quiet, daily arithmetic of wealth. The empires that lasted were those that understood their territory not just as space to be ruled, but as a living economy to be nurtured and harnessed. When that economic foundation cracked, the political structure above it, no matter how grand or sacred, was always the next to fall. Stone and steel became the new grammar of power. To control the landscape, a dynasty needed more than laws and oaths. It needed a physical presence that could not be ignored, a statement of dominance carved into the very earth itself. This was the military revolution of the castle and the knight, a pair of innovations that transformed how territory was claimed, held, and lost. The earliest castles were not the towering stone citadels we imagine today. They began as humble yet brutally effective designs, the motte and bailey. A lord would command his laborers to dig a deep ditch, piling the earth into a high, flat-topped mound, the motte. On this artificial hill, he would build a wooden tower, a lookout and final stronghold. At the base, a larger enclosed yard, the bailey, would hold workshops, stables, and barracks, all protected by a wooden palisade and another ditch. This was power made visible and defensible on a budget. A small garrison in such a fortification could control a river crossing, a valley entrance, or a stretch of disputed frontier, projecting the lord's authority over the surrounding farms and villages. He could tax the local trade, dispense justice from his gatehouse, and retreat to safety if challenged. But wood burns and rots. The true leap forward came when dynasties with greater resources began rebuilding in stone. The Great Stone Keep, like the iconic White Tower of London built by William the Conqueror, was a different order of magnitude. Its thick walls defied fire and simple battering. Arrow slits allowed defenders to shoot from safety. Its presence was permanent, a declaration that the ruling family was here to stay. Castles evolved into complex puzzles of defense, with concentric walls, deadly gatehouses called barbicans, and strategically placed towers that allowed defenders to cover every angle of approach. These structures were not just military tools, they were the ultimate symbols of dynastic endurance, meant to outlast the lives of the men who built them. To garrison and support these castles, and to fight the battles in the fields between them, a new elite warrior class emerged as the backbone of medieval armies, the knight. His power was built on a revolutionary piece of technology, the stirrup. This simple metal ring, adopted from Eastern horsemen, allowed a rider to brace himself securely in the saddle. Now he could wield a long, heavy lance without being thrown from his horse by the impact. The result was the devastating cavalry charge, a hammer blow of concentrated force that could shatter infantry lines. But this knight was far more than a soldier. He was a node in the feudal network. His expensive warhorse, his custom-fitted chainmail hauberk, and his years of training were funded by the land grant from his lord, the fief. In return, he owed a set number of days of military service each year. This created a professional warrior class bound by personal loyalty and economic necessity to the great lords and ultimately to the king. A dynasty's military strength was literally counted in knights' fees, the number of these armed and armored horsemen its vassals could bring to the field. The castle and the knight together created a self-reinforcing system of control. A lord from his stone fortress protected the lands that produced the wealth to equip his knights. Those knights, in turn, patrolled the countryside and formed the army that defended the castle and expanded the lord's borders. For a centralizing monarchy, this system was a double-edged sword. A loyal network of castellans and knights could secure a kingdom, allowing a Capetian king or a Norman conqueror to consolidate their rule region by region. But the same tools in the hands of a discontented baron could shatter royal authority. A mighty earl, secure in his own impregnable castle and surrounded by his own loyal knights, could effectively secede from the kingdom, turning his territory into a private state. The landscape itself became a chessboard of these fortified strongholds, each one a potential pivot point for loyalty or rebellion. The map of Europe, therefore, was not just shaped by treaties and marriages, but by the strategic placement of these stone sentinels and the allegiance of the armored men who rode from their gates. A dynasty did not truly own a territory until it could answer one simple, brutal question: who holds the castles? A realm held together by one man's will could dissolve with his final breath. The most perilous moment for any dynasty was not a foreign invasion or a noble rebellion, but the natural, inevitable passing of the king. In that suspended silence between reigns, every alliance, every border, and every oath hung in the balance. This was the succession crisis, the ultimate stress test for a family's claim to the land, where the map was not just contested but could be torn entirely into new shapes. Consider the colossal empire of Charlemagne. His authority was a personal achievement, a masterpiece of force and charisma. Yet the system he operated within still treated that empire as a family estate. Upon his death, the unity he embodied was immediately pressured by the competing ambitions of his sons and grandsons. The civil wars that followed were not mere family squabbles. They were continental conflicts that exhausted the empire's strength and directly led to the Treaty of Verdun, the tripartite split that created the rough outlines of France, Germany, and that doomed Middle Kingdom. A single contested succession had dismantled a unified Christendom. These crises created a vacuum of power that sucked in every rival force. When the Anglo-Saxon King Edward the Confessor died without a direct heir in 1066, he left a crown with 3 claimants. Harold Godwinson seized the moment, but his claim was instantly challenged by Harald Hardrada, the Viking king of Norway, and by William of Normandy across the Channel. The result was not a polite debate but a year of frantic mobilization, culminating in 2 of the most famous battles in English history, fought within weeks of each other. Stamford Bridge saw the end of the Viking Age in England, and Hastings saw the end of Anglo-Saxon rule itself. The map of Britain was rewritten not by a long process, but in the violent resolution of a single succession dispute. The entire destiny of a nation pivoted on the question of who had the most convincing right to a dead man's throne. Within these crises, the nobility became kingmakers, and their loyalty was a currency traded in blood. Different factions of powerful magnates would back different candidates, whether a younger brother, a cousin, or the king's designated but untested son. Their support was rarely about abstract legality. It was a calculated gamble. Backing the winning claimant meant rewards, lands, and heightened influence. Backing the loser could mean exile, confiscation, or worse. This turned the kingdom into a chessboard of shifting allegiances, where regional lords used the uncertainty to expand their own power at the crown's expense. Often, these internal fractures were an open invitation to foreign neighbors. A rival dynasty watching a succession crisis unfold would see not a tragedy, but an opportunity. They might marry a claimant to lend legitimacy, send armies to support a faction, or simply invade to press their own ancestral claim. The borders became fluid as foreign troops crossed into what was once considered sovereign territory, sometimes never to leave. It was this recurring nightmare that forced dynasties to innovate, to move beyond the personal and create protocols for the impersonal transfer of power. The old Frankish habit of partible inheritance, dividing the kingdom like a pie, was a recipe for guaranteed crisis every generation. The slow, grinding adoption of primogeniture, passing everything to the eldest son, was a revolutionary act of political foresight. It was unfair to younger sons, but it provided clarity. It told every noble, every bishop, and every foreign ambassador exactly who the next king would be, allowing the machinery of state to keep turning without a catastrophic pause. Other systems offered different solutions. The elective monarchy, used in the Holy Roman Empire and in early Poland, gave a council of great nobles the formal power to choose. This could prevent a child or a tyrant from taking the throne, but it also institutionalized factional conflict, turning every succession into a high-stakes political campaign ripe for bribery and external interference. The creation of these rules was the most important bureaucratic project a dynasty could undertake. It was an attempt to legislate stability, to build a bridge over the chasm of a king's death. A clear succession law was a dynasty's promise to its own future, a way to ensure the family name and the territorial realm became permanently fused. Without it, even the most glorious conquests were temporary. A single contested succession could unravel decades, even centuries of careful state building in a few chaotic, bloody years. The map remembered not only who won the wars, but which families learned how to peacefully pass the crown, transforming a moment of ultimate fracture into a mere ceremonial pause in the endless project of ruling the land. A dynasty's true victory was not written in land deeds, but in illuminated manuscripts and soaring stone vaults. While the sword could conquer territory, only culture could conquer time. The most visionary ruling families grasped a profound truth, that to make their names synonymous with an era, they needed to become patrons of the mind and the spirit. This was not charity, it was a calculated, long-term investment in a legacy that would outshine their mortal reigns. Consider the quiet scholar at a candle-lit desk, not the knight on his charger, as a primary agent in forging the map of Europe. A king who funded such a scholar was building a monument far more durable than any castle wall. Charlemagne's palace school at Aachen did more than teach Latin grammar. It standardized a written language for administration and liturgy across his vast multilingual empire. By gathering intellectuals like Alcuin of York, he was not merely displaying sophistication. He was creating a unified class of literate clergy and officials who could run a Christian empire from a shared cultural script. This Carolingian Renaissance was a conscious revival of Roman order through the lens of faith, and it stamped the Frankish realm with an identity of enlightened Christian rule. Centuries later, the Ottoman dynasty pursued a similar strategy, but with a distinct artistic signature. Otto I and his successors actively promoted a vibrant style of manuscript illumination, metalwork, and architecture that art historians now call Ottoman art. By commissioning lavish gospel books and building magnificent cathedrals like those at Magdeburg, they visually proclaimed their divine right to rule. Their patronage created a cohesive cultural aesthetic that mirrored their political project of unifying the German duchies, making their imperial authority something beautiful, tangible, and God-given. Perhaps the most enduring example lies just north of Paris. The Abbey of Saint Denis, under the steady patronage of the Capetian kings, became the cradle of a revolutionary architectural style, Gothic. With its pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and walls of stained glass, it seemed to dissolve stone into light, creating a heaven on earth. The Capetians shrewdly made it their royal necropolis, the burial place for their kings. Generation after generation was laid to rest there, their tombs surrounded by the very architecture their dynasty had fostered. Saint Denis became a permanent stone argument for Capetian legitimacy, a physical manifestation of their divine favor and their central role in French identity. In each case, patronage transformed a family name into a historical period. We speak of the Carolingian Renaissance, the Ottoman period, the Gothic age of the Capetians. This was the ultimate branding. A dynasty became associated not just with battles and laws, but with an entire cultural atmosphere, a golden age that defined their realm in the memory of posterity. This cultural capital proved remarkably resilient even when political fortunes waned. The memory of a united empire under Charlemagne, celebrated in chronicles and art, haunted the imagination of later medieval rulers. For centuries, German emperors and French kings alike looked back to that Carolingian ideal as a lost golden standard, a map of unity they felt compelled to restore. The cultural legacy, carefully cultivated centuries before, became a ghost that shaped future ambitions, inspiring wars and alliances aimed at piecing a fractured continent back into its imagined, glorious whole. The stones of a cathedral, the lines of a poem, the delicate gold leaf on a sacred text, these were the quiet, persistent tools of dynastic ambition. They shaped how people saw their world, their rulers, and themselves. A realm defined by such cultural achievements developed a pride and a cohesion that could survive military defeat or a weak king. It created an identity that was harder to erase than a border. In the long contest to stamp a family name upon the land, the patron who built a library or a masterpiece often built a more permanent claim than the conqueror who simply took the field. The lines on our modern maps are not accidents of geography, but the long, cold shadows of ancient family ambitions. Look at the border between France and Germany, a line contested for centuries. Its deepest fault line was not drawn in the 19th or 20th century, but in the 9th by the Treaty of Verdun. That division of the Carolingian Empire into East and West Francia created two distinct political cores that hardened over 1,000 years into rival national identities, their conflicts echoing the original fracture between royal brothers. The map remembers what history books sometimes forget. The Norman Conquest of 1066 did far more than install a new king on the English throne. It grafted a French-speaking ruling class onto an Anglo-Saxon base, forcing a linguistic fusion that slowly gave birth to Middle English, a language richer and more complex for the collision. It replaced the old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with a Norman one, whose castles still dot the landscape, and it initiated the common law system, built on royal judges and precedent, which remains the foundation of legal thought in England and many of its descendant nations across the globe. Far to the south, the centuries-long project of the Reconquista, driven by the rival Christian dynasties of Leon, Castile, and Aragon, did not merely push a frontier. It forged a militant, crusading ideal of religious and cultural unity that became central to Spain's national character, an identity solidified in the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella and the final capture of Granada. This legacy, while a source of pride, also carried profound consequences for diversity and coexistence on the peninsula, and the great medieval struggle between Pope and Emperor over who held the right to crown a king established a tension between spiritual and temporal authority that would define Western political thought. It led to reformation, to wars of religion, and to ongoing debates about the proper role of faith in public life, debates whose roots are found in the standoff at Canossa. The dynastic principle itself, the idea that a realm was the property of a royal family, gradually evolved. As kingdoms became more centralized and bureaucratized, the loyalty once given to a person began to transfer to the institution of the crown, and then, slowly, to the abstract concept of the nation itself. The feudal divisions between a duke's land and a king's domain often hardened into the provincial and national borders we recognize today. To trace these lines back is to see the European map for what it truly is, a palimpsest. That is a manuscript where old writing has been scraped away to make room for the new, but where the ghost of the original text remains, faintly visible beneath the surface. The bold, modern names of France, Germany, England, and Spain are written over the older, fainter scripts of Francia, Saxony, Wessex, and Castile. And beneath those, we can still just make out the oldest marks of all, the names of the families who first dared to stamp their will upon the land, the Merovingians with their sacred hair, the Carolingians with their renewed empire, the Capetians with their patient, relentless consolidation. Their rivalries, their marriages, their triumphs, and their failures are not locked in the past. They are the hidden grammar of the present, the reason a river is a border, and not just a river, the reason a language has the words it does, the reason a nation tells itself the story it tells. The map of Europe is a storybook of dynasty, and we are all living inside its final, still unfolding chapter. The story of Europe's map is a family story. It was not drawn by geography or destiny, but by the very human ambitions of rival dynasties, a slow, relentless drama played out across generations. These families did not inherit nations, they invented them, forging realms through the sword, sanctifying them through the sacrament, and binding them through strategic marriage. And just as often, they watched their life's work fracture on the rocks of inheritance disputes and bitter familial strife. Every pivotal moment we have traced, from Clovis stepping into the baptismal font to unite faith and crown, to the fateful signatures on the Treaty of Verdun that split an empire, from the imperial coronation of Charlemagne in St. Peter's to the pragmatic election of Hugh Capet in a fragile kingdom, was a family decision. These choices, made in throne rooms and on battlefields, determined where borders would harden, which languages would dominate, and which cultures would shape the future. The map we recognize today is their legacy, a political landscape carved by the ambitions of fathers and the rebellions of sons. To understand why Europe looks the way it does, why certain rivalries feel ancient and certain unities feel fragile, we must look past the lines on the parchment to the people who drew them. This dynastic drama is the key to understanding the continent itself, a place whose modern identity was hammered out, piece by contested piece, on the anvil of medieval family politics. These were not impersonal forces of history, but flesh and blood individuals making choices that echoed for 1,000 years. If this journey into the forging and fracturing of history's map has captivated you, there is so much more to explore. Consider subscribing for more deep dives into the past that shaped our present, and we would love to hear your thoughts. Which dynasty's story do you find most compelling? Share your perspective in the comments below.